Ah, the early 2000s. There was nothing better than getting home from school and seeing that your parents had rented you out a game from Blockbuster. Sometimes you get a game like Super Monkey Ball and have a life-altering experience, and other times you'd get a game like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and have a life-altering experience. One game I remember distinctly my parents renting out for me first and then later purchasing was none other than Sonic Heroes. Gee, how could you have ever guessed? This was my first 3D Sonic game. I had played all the classic 2D games on Sonic Mega Collection previously, and got pretty frustrated because I couldn't make it out of the second zone in a single level. But with Sonic Heroes, I had a good time. It's funny because as a kid, you're basically playing a game in a complete bubble. You're not concerned with Metacritic scores or angry reviewers or sweaty Reddit gamers. Your opinion is as unbiased and as pure as Purell. And so it was my complete surprise as I became a teen and later an adult that some people kind of hate this game. I haven't spoken about 3D Sonic on this channel yet because it's honestly kind of a tough situation to add to the discourse to, because every game has been talked about and reviewed to death, including this one. Like, even making fun of the trope that Sonic has had a rough transition into 3D has become a cliche of itself. But the reason I take a stake in Sonic Heroes is I find this game interesting, since people don't usually like to lump it in with Adventure 1 or 2 despite being classic 3D Sonic games, but it really isn't part of the so-called dark era either. So I wanted to personally take a deep dive into this game for myself and also just see why people kind of treat this game as some bizarre entity. It's well known by now that Sega first tried to give Sonic his grand leap into 3D on the now forgotten console, the Sega Saturn. I mean, they did try, looking at the unreleased demo, Sonic X-Treme, but how much credit can you really give Sega when they made a conscious decision to produce a game with a goddamn fisheye lens? Did they even make this game in good faith? Look, here's the issue with not only Sonic X-Treme, but the Sega Saturn in a nutshell. This console was basically an incorrect prediction towards the future of the gaming industry, and while it was definitely capable of 3D-like graphics, it truly excelled the most at further improving 2D gaming. So it goes without saying that this game had an extremely hellish development cycle, and it goes without saying because it was canceled. This game doesn't exist. In fact, this game had such a crazy development cycle that the employees surrounding the project had literally started to become ill. Developer Chris Sen would literally continue to work on this game despite puking constantly and a nurse saying that he had 6 months to live. Take note of this, it will become relevant later. Anyways, yeah, the resources that were put into Sonic X-Treme would ultimately funnel into a separate game and franchise, Nights into Dreams, the Sega Saturn's flagship title. I told you that this console failed, right? There was Sonic R, a racing game that became a cult classic among people who enjoy masochism, and Sonic 3D Blast. This game was also released on the Sega Genesis. I mentioned that the Saturn failed, right? I've actually already covered Sonic 3D Blast. It's an okay game, but I wouldn't say it was a masterpiece either. I feel like it had some smart ideas, but ultimately it wasn't really a 3D experience. Oh, but it's isometric. Right, and almond milk is a dairy product. Grow the f up. The fans awaited a true 3D Sonic game. Probably, I don't know, it's just a line that YouTubers say. I wasn't even alive at the time. And well, a true 3D Sonic experience would arrive with the Sega Dreamcast in 1998 in Japan and 1999 in North America. I'm not gonna spend too much time talking about the Sonic Adventure games in this video. For one, I'd like to leave the door open in case I wanna do an actual review of those games down the road. And for two, I don't feel like people sending squad cars after me and my family. I just don't. Sonic Adventure, like it or hate it, is a cult classic. It reviewed well, and there's a handful of Sonic fans that still love it to this very day. I don't. Like, look, the game is fine. I would never go so far as to say that Sonic Adventure was bad by any means, but I do think it's a sloppy and flawed product at a very minimum. There were some cute ideas here. For instance, instead of one long campaign, you would play 6 individual mini stories, half of which I would define as almost playable. Sonic was fun, Tails was more Sonic, and Knuckles just wasn't for me. Amy was super slow, E120 Gamma was just kind of boring, and Big actually made me stop playing the game entirely. Not a joke. Look, for the purposes of this video, I'll say what I did like about this game. The controls were pretty damn good for Sonic, and there was some good old cheesy charm. Too bad I'm lactose intolerant. Sonic Adventure did something special though that Extreme wouldn't have been able to do, and that Sonic R or 3D Blast definitely didn't do. It ultimately showed that this format had massive potential and could only grow from here. So it's no surprise that Sonic Adventure 2 would follow in 2001, and for a lot of Sonic fans, it ended up being one of the best games of the series to this very day. It's no masterpiece, sure, but I personally feel Sonic Adventure 2 is one of the best Sonic games ever released, and maybe even Sega products altogether. For one, it really cut down on some of the extra fat that Sonic Adventure 1 had. Instead of having 6 different gameplay styles, there were 3, meaning that the gameplay that was present was able to be a lot more refined, and even those styles were done over 2 storylines instead of, 6. It just feels to me that Sonic Adventure 2 arrived with more of a purpose, more of a coherent vision, that could appeal to just about everybody except for haters. The tragic part about Sonic Adventure 2 was how it ultimately was restricted to the Sega Dreamcast initially, which again was a pretty major failure of a console. Sonic Adventure 2 is essentially Sega's swan song for their own consoles, and was the final major Sega title to be released on the platform. I said major, and Sonic Adventure 2 is basically as good as any title to go out on. These 2 games would eventually receive remasters on the Nintendo GameCube, but Sega was still in a precarious situation, as the majority of gamers on PS2 and Xbox wouldn't have had knowledge about the Sonic Adventure series, or at least not that many of them. So Sega basically had to start fresh with the 3D Sonic series here, kind of just giving it a new branding and new name recognition so everyone can jump into the fun. But don't worry, I'm sure they'll make a Sonic Adventure 3 one day. This new game was Sonic Heroes. As said, this game would be completely independent of the adventure titles, a decision I can't say I really fault Sega for. You have to remember that Sonic was a blockbuster hit during the days of the Sega Genesis, and this was for a lot of people going to be the first Sonic game since Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Okay, don't kill me Sega fanboys, but here's the truth. No one owned a Sega CD, no one owned a 32X, no one owned a Saturn, and only a handful of people even owned a Dreamcast. It would be like if on the Nintendo Switch, instead of making Super Mario Odyssey, they made Super Mario 3D World 2, or Super Mario Sunshine 2 for the Wii. Now, you certainly don't need to have played a previous game in the series to understand the context of the franchise, but by marketing it to fans as an independent project, you are more likely to appeal to a wider demographic of people, including me, because I hate starting a game series with something numbered 13. No, I don't care if it's an independent story. I can't go into it knowing I'm missing the context of the series. I'm a freaking nerd. I kind of said this earlier, but the weird thing about Sonic Heroes is just how history treats it. Again, people don't like to associate this with the adventure games, but no one likes to associate it with the later games, making this game sort of a black sheep of the Sonic series, which if you've seen some of the weird games that have come out here, I think that kind of says a lot. Circling back to its release before we start our adventure, I think it should be noted that Sonic Heroes would release on 3 platforms during its original run: the Nintendo GameCube, the original Xbox, and tax fraud. Yeah, so the PS2 version isn't great. It's not unplayable, and Sega basically had to make it, as the PS2 was, and hell, is still the best-selling console of all time. There was even a rumor that Sega had to make a PS2 version, or Sony wouldn't let Sega ever make a game on their console again. And that's why you don't give children access to the internet, because this rumor is a load of horse. But yeah, the PS2 version was rough. It had a way worse performance and the graphics were way worse, and a lot of the spectacle was minimized in that version of the game. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if this game's mixed reputation actually developed from people who grew up with the PS2 version. This was by far the worst, but it was the best selling, so maybe that explains it a bit. And if you did grow up with the PS2 version and hate this game because of that, I present a judgment-free pass from me. Expires once you have another crappy take though. Booting up the game, we're immediately presented with 4 possible story paths, or teams. And here I thought the hardest decision I would have to make was whether or not to get out of bed for another day. Sonic Heroes works unlike any other Sonic game in the series history, or really unlike any video game that I'm aware of. Each of the 4 teams has 3 characters, comprising of a speed type, a flying type, and a fighting type. Just barely doing enough to beat the Pokemon clone accusations there, Sega. Throughout the levels, you'll switch between 3 types depending on what's needed to progress. It may seem simple, but there's actually a decent amount of depth to the way this works. The speed characters, or at least Sonic and Shadow, get the light speed dash, which is really cool when it works 90% of the time, and every speed character besides Amy can do this sick ninja stuff where you jump between walls. Speed characters can also dash and just move the fastest in general, along with getting a cool little tornado blast move to flip over turtles. Flying characters somehow are able to get their 3 characters in a vertical stack, which physicists to this day are still trying to wrap their heads around how that worked. The flying archetype gives you a limited amount of flight capabilities, which you can boost further with the A button until the game decides that you can't. This is used not only to increase your height, but can also be about jumping over gaps or trying to get somewhere in the distance. Good news, fans of the Z-axis, and this is for you. Flying characters can also shoot dumbing ring bombs if they somehow end up alone. No one knows why, but this came back in Sonic 06, so it's relevant to bring up. And finally, the power characters. Beginning the consequential trend of adding combat to Sonic games. These characters are responsible for fighting robots mainly and bashing in massive doors as well. And they can glide. I mean, this is clearly based on Knuckles' signature move from Sonic 3, but how does that transfer to a robot or crocodile, you might just say? It just does, okay? Circling back to the combat aspect real quick though, I've seen people compare this to the fighting that would later be seen in Unleashed or Frontiers, and I'm sorry, but like, you're actually objectively wrong. Like, sure, there are some enemies that get on my damn nerves, and some that do take way too long to beat, but the combat that does exist here is just mainly to provide extra value to your fighting characters. It's not to pad out the game or slow you down or make you hate your life. I think it's a valid critique, but a bit overplayed by the haters of this game. So you might ask, what are the main differences between the four teams if they all sort of do the same stuff? Well, they all share pretty similar levels and bosses, but Team Sonic is sort of your basic story, Team Rose is your easy mode, Team Dark is a hard mode, and you can consider Team Chaotic sort of a miscellaneous mode where you're tasked with doing missions. Now, we'll talk about the individual story threads in just a bit, but I do want to point out that there are small differences between the teams and their characters. SBO, for instance, can use his tornado spin to turn invisible, which has basically only the uses of hiding from enemies and passing through lasers, which gets used like twice in the game, but it is used period, and it's important to note. Amy is unlike the other speed characters entirely, in the sense that she can't use a light speed dash or even hop off walls. This was probably done because Team Rose is supposed to be peep-pee baby easy, but it still makes the playthrough way less fun and snappy in my opinion. And all the fighting characters fight in their own special sort of ways. Vector shoots bubblegum. I guess it's time we take a look at the story. I'll be honest, I kinda hate reviewing the story in these games. I've always been at odds at what most Sonic fans prioritize in their games. For me, I've always seen Sonic more as a cartoon character and valued the more lighthearted and simple to its core storylines. That's a big reason future Sonic games pushed me away a bit, starting with Shadow and honestly continuing to this very day with some exceptions. It's hard for me to really feel attached to the storylines presented in games like Sonic Unleashed, Sonic 06, and the storybook games, because they always just feel like they bite off more than they can chew, and it's hard for me to take these characters seriously. It's not that I don't like story in video games. The Xenoblade trilogy is mostly one of my favorite series of all time. It's more so that when I play a platformer about a blue hedgehog, I'm not expecting Shakespeare or to be entertained in some sort of narrative sense. I just want to turn on my brain and go fast. And if there is a story at all, I don't mind if it's just there to give me a few laughs, the way that Sonic Colors did. Sonic fans, I'm gonna remind you I'm in witness protection currently, so don't kill me. So with that perspective in mind, I actually have to say I think Sonic Heroes basically nails the story. Now, don't get me wrong, this story isn't deep. It's barely even coherent at all. It's a goddamn mess. I fucking love it. With Team Sonic, we see the trio running through some mystery desert that's never seen again. I mean, it's not a huge deal, it just looks like the goddamn Looney Tunes desert, and I think that's funny. Anyways, Sonic receives a letter from Dr. Eggman, unveiling his scariest and most deadly invention yet. Paper that can project digital videos on top of it. I love that he went through all this effort to create this paper that shows him speaking, and then he chose to put goddamn impact font on top of it. Ooh, now, what font should I use? Haha, I will choose impact font. My dog is looking at me like I... So basically, Eggman has this super evil weapon that will be completed in a mere 3 days. Okay, Eggman, so why the f would you write this letter and even warn them? You absolute fool. He could have just ended the world otherwise without telling anyone about it. And then, what could even be done at that point? And you know what? This is more of a general question, but why do all these supervillains work so hard to end the world? What benefit does that actually have to them? Great, you just ruined a civilization and society that as is barely functions. You're probably dead with them if you tried to blow up the world or something, but go for it. Switching gears to Team Dark, Rouge commits a felony called breaking and entering. I would dissect this crime and figure out how much jail time she would receive, but no one found that bit funny besides me in the Jet Set Radio video, so it's dead. Okay, so she breaks in and finds Shadow, who's suffering from chronic memory loss. This could be seen as sort of a retcon, as at the end of Sonic Adventure 2, Shadow died, and thus the grand ending of that game probably has a lot less meaning in retrospect. But here's the situation Sega put themselves in, right? You gotta view it from their perspective. They made this cool-ass companion to Sonic who was a central key character that very clearly immediately was in the ranks of Tails and Knuckles, and then they killed him in the same game he was introduced in. So they kinda had to bring him back in some form or the other, and it was gonna get messy. Plus, there were millions of 10-year-olds threatening Sega executives with Nerf guns. Allegedly. Sonic Team does kind of attempt to cover the plot holes during the story, but this overall thread in general probably leads to more questions than answers. At the end of the team story, it's revealed that Eggman just has this giant warehouse with thousands of Shadow clones. So, was the Shadow in this adventure a clone? Is that why he's just forgetful? I mean, I'm sure it's answered in Shadow the Hedgehog, but that game sucks, so I don't really care. It's a mess, quite honestly, but only if you care about Sonic Adventure 2. And if you don't, this whole story thread doesn't make sense at all. So Sega, please absolutely no one with this story. Good job. Oh, and there's also 123 Omega, who's basically a replacement for E102 Gamma from Sonic Adventure 1. So this team has two characters that have died and been resurrected in some form. I guess it's called Team Dark for a reason, because that's downright depressing. Team Rose's story isn't anything special, but isn't anything bad either, which for a Sonic story makes it brilliant. It's as simple as Amy wants to stalk Sonic to marry him. Yep, that's very normal behavior, making this the second team to commit a felony. Big the Cat wants to find Froggy, and Cream wants to find a Chow called Chocola. That's it. That's the story. I literally do not know what else to say about this. And finally, we have Team Chaotix. Now, imagine being a kid in the year 2003, or like 2005 when I played this. You look at this team and go, oh my god. Wait, who the hell are these guys? Well, Team Chaotix is basically a massive deep cut to a game called Knuckles Chaotix, released on the Sega 32X. Now, imagine being a kid in the year 2024. You hear the term 32X and go, oh my god. Wait, what the hell is that? Well, the Sega 32X was an add-on to the Sega Genesis that would turn the console from 16-bit to 32-bit. It may sound stupid, and that's because it largely was, but at the time it was sort of a novel concept, especially since no one really knew the future of the gaming industry. Imagine if instead of buying a whole new console, you could spend half the price and still theoretically use your hardware to be in the next generation. Now they just charge $500 for a pro version. Anyways. To make something like this work though, you absolutely needed great games to release for it, and so a Sonic title seemed inevitable, and Sega agreed and disagreed at the same time. Yeah, so there was Knuckles Chaotix, which introduced characters you've probably never heard of in the Sonic franchise, such as Vector the Crocodile, Mighty the Armadillo, Espio the Chameleon, and Charmy the Bee. The character that looks the most like Sonic was cut from this team. So yeah, this is kind of the deep cut fan service team, and there were apparently supposed to be even more of these, such as Fang, Bean, and Bark from Sonic Fights, and Metal Sonic, Ray, and Mighty the Armadillo in another team. I see why that was cut, because it's just, like, how do you even write that? Yeah, so I don't know where else to really place this in the video, but I kind of just wanted to share an antidote from my childhood. So I used to go to the library and rent out those big Guinness World Book of Records. There was a gaming edition, I think 2009 was the year it was, and there was something in it saying that Sonic Heroes won an award for having the most playable characters in a 3D platformer. No. So this has to be BS, right? Like, this simply just can't be true. If you count them as platformers, which debatably you should, every Lego game beats that out easily. Jet Set Radio Future, literally defined by Wikipedia as a platformer, has 24 characters. And are we really gonna act like each character is seriously that unique? Like, sure, the speed and power characters do have differences, but the flying characters are basically just clones of each other. So I'd like to know how much Sega paid off Guinness World Records for this absolutely buffoon clown record. Even worse, that someone left a comment recently saying how Mario Wonder beat this out. And Guinness actually responded like 15 years after this record was made by saying, no, the Yoshis are the same. But you know what? Tails and Rouge are so fucking different, right? Anyways, Team Chaotix. They got a call from some guy on a speaker and they do missions for him. I literally do not know what else to say about this. Throughout the stories, kind of like the Sonic Adventure games, certain teams will meet up and interact in a cutscene before duking out to the death. It's at least sort of a neat pace breaker, but you can tell they really have no narrative reason to meet up or nothing to say to each other. Like when Team Rose runs into Team Sonic, Amy basically says, hey, I'm gonna beat the ever-living crap out of you so you can marry me. Yep, I'm sure that'll make Sonic fall deeply in love with you. Or it just kind of boils down to mysterious weird people are over there, let's go fight them. That is how you end up in prison. The individual stories end in sort of a whatever resolution, as they aren't intended to be the final conclusion of the game, which is only unlocked after beating all 4 stories. So we'll get to that later, but for now let's talk about the gameplay, the part I actually give a crap about. As said, Sonic Heroes is probably one of the most interesting gameplay loops that I've ever seen in the Sonic series. Again, you switch between your speed, power, and flying characters, and the levels here always just have you fairly engaged. There's never an extended period of time where you're just playing as one character, or at a minimum, you have a choice to switch to another via multiple routes the level provides you. There's just so many ways to approach so many different situations that I feel like this game actually presents a lot of freedom. For instance, the combat isn't limited to just the power characters. The speed characters can defeat them with their homing attacks and disarm them with the aforementioned tornado spin. The flying characters can use their own tornado blast to make flying enemies fall, and the power characters can punch. You can sort of use these characters interchangeably though, even if it's not always optional. So the game largely lets you play as who you want to, providing the player with both guidance and general freedom at the same time. And if you press Z upon filling up your power meter, you can use a Team Blast, which is really cool except for Team Dark because you end up just sitting around and waiting because like I know that they're using chaos control, but I can't progress at the freaking level, Sega, please. So as said, there's just a good amount of freedom here. There's even small differences with the mechanics like the cannons, which lets you fire in a different direction depending on what character you enter with. So you're always thinking about who you should play as at a given moment. It's cool. And generally speaking, Sonic Heroes makes a solid effort to be more like the classic Sonic games rather than Sonic Adventure 1 and 2. When you really sit down and think about it, there's really a ton of similarities. Each world has 2 acts followed by a boss fight. There are exactly 7 zones. You can access secret stages in between levels to get Chaos Emeralds, and the music and graphics look literally like a 2D Sonic game realized in 3D. As talked about earlier, this is sort of because Sega wanted to distance themselves from Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, and I don't blame them. I'd want to distance myself from Sonic Adventure 1 as well. Okay, that's the last Sonic Adventure 1 joke. Like, this video already made so many people mad. Like, at this point, it's just the cherry on top of the gravy. Throughout the levels, you are able to level up your characters as well, upon touching a glowing orb in increments of 3. I like this system because you can seriously tell the difference between being at tier 0 and being at tier 3, but if you are at tier 0, it's not like the game suddenly becomes unplayable either. There's just an overall incentive to play well in Sonic Heroes, and it's something I feel works well most of the time. Please note the most of the time. Yeah, so here's the thing about Sonic Heroes. It's a really finicky game. For instance, to attack as your power characters, you usually find yourself mashing the B button to fight the enemies. And then your character, being the literal clown that he is, will sometimes just punch right off the edge to your very demise. Bam! Screwed over, and that's just not my fault. And unfortunately, taking a death in Sonic Heroes can be fairly punishing. There are a healthy amount of checkpoints, don't get me wrong, but upon a death, you lose all of your level ups. And while the game is still playable in that mode, it can feel like a huge setback to be playing out of your frickin' mind and then be back to playing like a scrub over something that isn't your fault. And of course, I'd have to be crazy not to talk about the fact that Heroes is one of the slippier Sonic games to this day. I do think people overextend this argument. It's not that bad, and there are failsafes such as your speed character automatically stopping at an edge, but it's still an imperfect system that perhaps rightfully has made a lot of people angry over the years. I do think these flaws are probably why this game hasn't held up all that well in the court of public opinion, where people deliver guilty verdicts based off of their crappy memories. I don't really fault people for it, to be fair. Deaths that aren't your fault are not acceptable in any video game and can absolutely hamper the final quality of a product. But at the same time, I think it's dishonest to pretend that other Sonic games up to this point and after have had perfect controls. I plenty of times experienced Sonic Adventure 1, or even had jank stuff happen in Sonic Frontiers. This is going to make people mad, but bad controls aren't exclusive to Sonic Heroes in this franchise, not by a long shot. So I find it kind of odd how this game has become sort of the sacrificial hedgehog for this complaint, and the jank isn't restricted to just the controls either. For instance, the rails are probably one of the most infamous instances of this game being kind of glitchy. You'd think it would just be a simple hold right or hold left or jump, and sometimes it is and more cleanly, and then sometimes you just jump off into an endless abyss to the depths of hell because the game felt like it. To get around this, I usually would just ride these as the flying characters. So if there's any unfair discrepancy between my controls and what's happening on screen, I can cheese the game back because sometimes it's just how you have to deal with life. but that is in no way a fair substitute for a player to have to pick up on, and not to mention it just looks stupid. And I got my own complaints too. I've never seen anyone talk about these specifically, but I hate these goddamn switches that just fly in the middle of nowhere. You obviously are supposed to use your flying character to latch on and pull it out, but actually grabbing upon these feels incredibly finicky, and then start feeling yourself go insane, going up and down, mashing the B button worse than a Mario Party minigame. Or how about these aforementioned fights between the teams? You literally can just sit here and mash buttons, and stuff certainly will happen on the screen. I'm pretty sure you could win one of these blindfolded. Sometimes you'll knock everyone off in sheer moments, and sometimes they just won't die at all. And it's like, did anyone even bother testing these? And like, I've said that before, and some reviewers say that line is like a half sarcastic joke, like, oh, the game isn't tested, ha ha ha. But no, in this instance, I'm actually asking if these were tested, because I don't think a human being did. But my absolute least favorite aspect of Sonic Heroes are the Chaos Emerald challenges. What a disgusting mess. Now, as I said, Chaos Emerald challenges date back to the days of 2D Sonic from the very beginning. Sonic 1 was about trying not to puke, Sonic 2 was a neat little graphical flex where you collected rings in a tube, and Sonic 3 furthered that idea a bit, having Sonic traverse in a literal open field, which almost predicted what 3D Blast would look like. I've never really been a fan of this game design approach where basically you can play the entire game, get to the end, and the game developer said, oh, sorry, you didn't actually beat our game, you should have done this whole extra thing. Like, it just feels disrespectful to the player's time. Super Princess Peach did that, Miss Pac-Man's Maze Madness kinda did that, 2D Sonic games did that, and every time that's happened to me, I felt robbed of my experience in a way. Like, it made me feel like my victory was very, very much not deserved. So, I think it's just a dick move to require people to do this to get the true ending. And that's not even the worst of it. Getting the 7 Chaos Emeralds usually would reward the player with Super Sonic and the true ending of the game, and the developers would surely make it known to you if you screwed up by neglecting them. First of all, to even access a special mission to get a chance at fighting for a Chaos Emerald, you have to get the key in Act 2 specifically, not Act 1, and bring it all the way to the end of the level without taking a single hit. Now that alone is a real pain in the ass sometimes, let me tell you. I mean, it's not impossible, but these are long levels, sometimes upwards of 10 and maybe 15 minutes in Team Dark. Unless you're a literal speedrunner, you're going to take hits on your first playthrough. Human error will just literally dictate that. Now, to the game developer's credit, there are at least multiple keys scattered throughout the levels, so it's not like you literally have to go the entire 10 or 15 minutes without taking a hit, as long as you know where to get another key. But it's just such a punishing and sort of stressful system that leaves such a bad taste in my mouth, one that no toothpaste could save. And that's not even the worst of it. So you get a key in Act 2 to the end of the level. Well, guess what? The actual bonus levels are basically entirely broken. Remember when I asked if the team fights were untested? Well, the team fights are basically Ocarina of Time in comparison to this absolute disgrace and pathetic excuse the developers refer to as gameplay. These levels are ultimately sort of based around Sonic 2, which did it 10 times better 10 years before this game. You have to collect shiny colored orbs in a tube and fill up your speed meter. And then by mashing the B button to the point you receive Carpal Tunnel, catch up to the Chaos Emerald and sort of a race to the finish line sort of thing. Why Sonic 2 worked well in this regard was because they made and custom tailored a specific gameplay style and engine specifically for these rings. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it was playable and something you could genuinely sit down and get good at with practice. So in Sonic Heroes, they took the base game engine, made a circular tube without thinking about how the physics engine, wouldn't automatically work. They throw a bunch of spiky balls on the tubes, and there you go. And if you hit one of those spiky balls, it's just over. Don't even bother, you may as well just reset. And sometimes with these tubes, I swear that you'll just magically lose speed, almost like you're clipping on the edge of something. And if you lose speed, don't even bother, you may as well just reset. Oh, but let's say you do have to reset. You can't just simply try again if you make a mistake. Oh no. If you need another try at getting a Chaos Emerald, that means you literally have to play the entire second mission again from the start just to get another try. die. Now, you do technically have 4 chances to get each Chaos Emerald by virtue of the 4 stories, all leading to 1 cumulative collection of emeralds. But outside of that, if you don't get the Chaos Emeralds throughout your playthrough, what you're basically forced to do is just boot up Team Rose in this game's mission mode, since those levels can be done in under 3 or 4 minutes, and just play the same crap over and over until you get the emerald. And just to point out one kind of marginal difference, the classic Sonic games were not that restricted in terms of obtaining the Chaos Emeralds. You could get your first Chaos Emerald in Green Hill Zone 1 and finish within the first 7 non-boss acts. Here, you have no luxury of avoiding that at all. And it may seem like I'm spending an awful lot of time on a bonus mode, right? Oh, except for the fact that you literally do need to get all the Chaos Emeralds to see the last story of the game. So I'll take as much damn time as I want on this as I please. If you don't like it, click off the video. I don't care. Please like and subscribe. Here's the final, but arguably a most important issue. And this could just be a me-specific problem, but mashing to get through these levels genuinely hurts my hand. This isn't the first game that I've had this problem with. Pac-Man World 1's Space Invader boss also put me in a serious amount of pain. There was actually a point in this video's production where I genuinely thought I was going to have to cheat or use an action replay or something just to access the final story. Now, I hate doing that for videos, as it feels like a cheap shot and I want an authentic experience of the playthrough. But my hand, and specifically wrist, was literally becoming strained and consistently hurt as a result of this game trying to get the Chaos Emeralds. Now, this may or may not be a hot take, but if you have a level or mechanic in a game that causes the player physical pain, it's perhaps not that good of a goddamn idea. And you know what? While we're talking about negatives, you know what else just sucks? The Casino Zone. It's beautiful, but it's completely broken. It's a cute idea, right? Being an obvious homage to the Casino Night Zone from Sonic 2. And the developers try to make it interesting by having mechanics such as bingos or slot machines. But you have no control when you're in an actual pinball machine, in a level that they expect you to make vertical progression in. Again, they just took the engine from the base game, threw some crap on here, and thought it would work flawlessly. I think you have more control over LA traffic than the pinball machines in this game. That alone can be pretty damn irritating, but then you have to consider, the main gimmick of this adventure. Basically what I'm getting at is if one of your 3 teammates just disappears or doesn't come with you or gets sent to the goddamn nether, there's an actual possibility that you can't switch to them. This game does have a failsafe in the event this happens, which is that your teammate will be waiting for you at the next checkpoint, but sometimes having to play without that character's archetype is a real pain in the ass. I talk all these negatives not just to crap on the game, but mainly because I want you guys to know while I love Sonic Heroes, I absolutely do hear and relate to a lot of the criticism I see for this game. I think it's important to bring these things up just for the purpose of not just being a shill for Sonic Heroes, because people are right, this game does have some serious problems. But while these are hard to ignore, I still think this game has a lot of positives that put it above basically every other Sonic game. The non-casino levels, for instance, are some of the tightest level design of the entire series up to this point. There are points in Sonic Heroes that almost feel as well designed as something you'd see in a Mario game, and that's some of the highest praise I can give to a game that Sega has made. Pan Castle is what instantly comes to mind for me as I write that. It feels like there's just a genuine amount of love put into this level, whether that be the drawings on the wall that turn into real enemies or preview what's next, or the consistent gimmick of flipping upside down and grinding on the rooftops. This is just a level that I consistently smile at while playing, and you can tell the developers had a real blast with it. Or hell, the opening levels of Seaside Hill and Ocean Palace are so well crafted, and a perfect learning curve into what Sonic Heroes will look like as an adventure. Grand Metropolis is amazing too. I love this futuristic type of look, with the flying cars ripped right out of the Jetsons and the blue flowing pathways. Even a level that pisses me off like Rail Canyon looks so downright beautiful. And perhaps that's why I remain so positive about this product when it punches me down. It's hard to be mad at it when you're having a consistent flow of dopamine just playing the game. Am I comparing Sonic Heroes to drugs? Yes. The levels are, in general, the sort of motif that I loved and appreciated in the classic Sonic games. One that invokes a genuine sense of curiosity. Just where the hell does this even exist in the Sonic universe? Who lives lives here? How do they even go from one wacky, completely different environment to another? It's so stupid, and I goddamn love it. Sonic Heroes in general is a product that cares a lot about spectacle. It's not always good or even needed, but it sure does exist. In fact, sometimes it just feels like they got a little too carried away with it, more than actually thinking about the player experience. For example, one area of the game they really made an effort to flex on the player with is a section where you're running from a giant alligator in Lost Jungle, one of 2 running away scenes this game has. Sonic Adventure 2 was typing about plagiarism accusations. First of all, if you're on your flying team member while you enter, the game will basically tell you to go screw yourself. So this isn't like the Rails where you could have a reliable but stupid fallback. You have to time like 30 A presses in a row here, and this could have just been a me issue. I do admittedly have some sensory overload issues, but there is just way too much happening on screen visually for me to coherently do this. The best way I've found to do this is to just close your eyes and not pay attention to anything on the screen and just pay attention to the whoosh. I know I'm being a bit repetitive, but Sonic Heroes is ultimately an experience that can be best defined by its highs and lows. It summarizes this game so well, and it's ultimately the thesis of this as a video essay. In a sense, this type of experience can be pretty frustrating for your average player. It's kind of irritating going from a well-designed level to a level that feels like it was tested by someone who passed out drunk. And then when you really think about it, it might make sense why someone would prefer a game like Sonic Frontiers or Sonic Colors, because I would argue those are more of a consistent 6 or 7 out of 10 experience. And maybe it's just completely valid for fans to prefer a consistent, clean adventure rather than the roller coaster that Heroes and even the adventure games present to the player. And this is of course accompanied by this game's absolutely mind-blowing soundtrack. Sonic Heroes to this day has a few of my favorite video game songs of all time. You know what? Even if you hate this game, even if you think this game killed your second mother, just listen to the soundtrack. Go to YouTube, listen to the soundtrack, vibe, have a good time, you deserve it. And even some of the less consequential stuff like the voice cast is just on point. I don't know if this is a hot take or not, but this is by far my favorite Sonic cast. Ryan Drummond is not only the best Sonic by a long shot, but also seemed to have really stepped into his role as the character by this game's release. So it's a great thing that he would have even more time to get better and better as... And the late Dean Bristow is absolutely my favorite Eggman. Shadow's voice is pristine. It just feels all so professional and coherent that compared to modern Sonic games, it's just kind of jarring. Knuckles has this really cool voice in this game. He sounds like an uncle who drinks beers at a Super Bowl party. I don't know how to describe it. He's got a real chill, laid-back personality and also could get this video demonetized. This game and everything it encompasses, to me, is what Sonic will always be, and why I will always fight for this game over the Dark Era games or games with more of a story or the corporate games, even if I'm the only one fighting for it. Everything about Heroes, and yes, that includes the negatives, makes it a Sonic game to me. There's no weird one-off characters, no unneeded gimmicks, no horrendous writing, no off-tone. It just feels perfect. There's a remarkable vibe and energy I get from this game and the experience it sets out for your player. And so Sonic Heroes is more than worth a playthrough. A playthrough. Not 4. So here's one of the biggest problems with Sonic Heroes and why I assume no one finished this game. To see the final part of the game, titled The Last Story, you have to collect all the Chaos Emeralds and also beat every single one of the 4 stories. The problem with this is that the levels basically remain the same between all 4 teams, so playing all 4 of them is kind of like eating too much of your favorite food. Now literally like 12-year-olds have probably learned about this, but I'm gonna explain it anyway. This is what's called the point of diminishing returns. First playthrough, you get your perfect fix, very, very happy. Next, maybe you shouldn't have had those seconds, you're not feeling as good. By the end, you're puking, and maybe that's disgusting, but that's literally science. To elaborate a bit more on the repetition here, Team Rose, for instance, being the easy team, basically just takes the Team Sonic levels and cuts them off a lot earlier. So like, sure, the story is easy to breeze through, but if you just played Team Sonic's playthrough, do you really want to sit down for another 2 to 3 hours just to play an easier version of the same game you just played? You might say, yeah, that's fine. Imagine that 90% of people who bought this are casuals and don't care about Sonic and absolutely wouldn't have even wanted to play this again. Team Dark, being the hard mode of this game, basically just takes Team Sonic's levels and makes them lengthier and with more generic goon enemies. Team Dark is probably my favorite cast of characters and feels the best to play, but the problem is their levels run so long. Sonic Heroes is already kind of infamous for having some of the lengthier levels in the series' history up to this point, so imagine that after 2 or 3 playthroughs. And then there's Team Chaotix. Look, Team Chaotix is either super fun or super super tedious on any given level. There is at least some variance in this playthrough compared to the 3 other teams, but at the end of the day, you're still basically playing the same levels as you did before. In fact, some levels of Team Chaotix are get to point A to point B. You can disguise this under collecting crabs or whatever all you want. It doesn't fool me, and it clearly didn't fool the thousands of fans who think this game is the second coming of Satan. And just a brief aside, but Team Chaotix has some of the lowest points in this entire game, honestly. There are some fun collection missions, like grinding rings at a casino, or finding and killing the 3 golden turtles. You know, pretty reasonable stuff. And then on the flip side, there's missions like killing every robot in a level, or blowing out every single torch in the Mystic Mansion. Whoever thought this was a good idea, I have to question their sanity. So basically the failsafe for Team Chaotix is if you miss one of these collectibles, it has a function that takes you back to the start of the level so you can do it all over again to find the one that you missed. Doesn't that sound so much fun? You can look at this overall system in 2 ways. For one, most casual players probably won't care about seeing the final story. It ties in very specifically to the series lore, and really, if you're not super invested, it's probably not worth going for anyways. Hell, I barely even cared and never went for the last story outside of this review. And if you look at the achievements for a game, even like GTA or something, look how many people don't make it past the first mission. And you're expecting the players to beat 4 stories? I feel like each individual story by itself is a really good experience, depending on what you want out of this game. I could see a more relaxed player playing Team Sonic or Team Rose, beating the string of levels and feeling satisfied with that. The stories on their own are a bit unfinished, but they wrap up sort of nicely, and it's a decent length of time. It is of my opinion that the best way to play Sonic Heroes is just play your playthrough of choice and don't worry about the other 3. And it's still a few hours, just like the classic 2D Sonic games. Like, in 2003, this would have been overpriced for sure, but just legally obtain this game. Insert smiling emoji. But on the other hand, having the final act and credits of a video game be locked behind something so irritating and time consuming just feels horrible. What I think would have been optimal is just maybe assigning each team a number based on difficulty. If you beat Team Dark Story, you instantly have completed 2 through 4 to avoid repetition. If you want an easier time with this game and feel like you need to ramp up to Team Dark's difficulty, you can start with Team Sonic or Team Rose, or just have it be 2 out of the 4 stories in general, or like a point system. Team Dark is 3 points, Team Rose is 1, Team Sonic and Chaotix are each 2, and you need to get to 4 or 5 or whatever. Like, look, you could probably point out flaws with the system I just brought up, but guess what? I'm not a game designer. It's not my job to come up with these things. So don't blame me for that. Blame Sega for causing the problem in the first place. It's pretty clear by now that Sonic Heroes was absolutely rushed. You can tell because the word Sonic is in the title. This game had a turnaround of less than 2 years, which is pretty short when all is said and done. And guess what? Another employee got sick while making this game. Jesus Christ, Sega. I told you that'd be relevant later. And if you thought playing this game 4 times just wasn't enough, there are optional missions to get emblems on each level for each team. This can range from beating the same level with a shorter amount of time, or to collecting more crabs as Team Chaotix. You get the picture. So really, to 100% this game, you have to play it 8 times. Oh, but after you clear these optional missions and collect all of the emblems, you unlock Ultra Hard Mode, which you can only play as Team Sonic. So that's 9 times that you have to beat this game if you're looking for a true completion. Like, my God, these levels are good, but not that good. It's actually incredible how much mileage Sega was able to get out of making literally 14 standard levels and 7 boss stages and just barely tweaking them from playthrough to playthrough. Maybe that's what they should have gotten a Guinness World Record for. It's not something that I really see as impressive though, because again, your average everyday player is not gonna wanna spend that much time playing the game. And I haven't even talked about the boss levels yet. And it may seem weird to talk about them here, but they're kind of just such an overthought that I barely even remember they're in this product. And they're a third of this game's levels. They aren't horrible, but also I can't name a positive thing about them if you held a gun to my head. I've already talked about the cockamamie, button-mashy arena fights, but there's also some boss levels where you have to fight enemies in waves. It's an okay way to break up the pace, but there's no checkpoints, which in Team Dark mode is a real nuisance, because what will happen is you'll get 5 minutes into one, get bodied by a bunch of trash because they pile on more than you can reasonably chew, and have to do it all over again. The third and final type of boss in this game are fights against Dr. Eggman, where he's flying as some ridiculous clown car contraption thing. Honestly, I never really know what I'm doing here. I just spam buttons or attacks and win, at least sometimes I do. I would say ultimately all three types of boss levels are fine. There's nothing overtly special about them, so I don't want to spend too much time talking about a nothing burger with a side of cheese. So look, I sometimes do get kind of frustrated when people review a game based off of its potential. And I see this for a lot of Sonic games, where people will say, well, I like this game because of what it could have been. 06 is probably the most pivotal example of this, because there is probably a good game there with another year or two of development. I've always been sort of at odds with that mindset and philosophy while reviewing games myself. What we have here is a game that was sold to me for $50, plus adjusted inflation for 2024, so like $500. Yet, I will be a hypocrite just for a little bit and say there was serious potential with Sonic Heroes if this game also had another year or so in development, and each team maybe got their own boss fights and levels. You have a really compelling idea for a video game, and it's sad to me the development of this game, clearly being as rushed as it was, essentially neutered it and made it a disliked Sonic game in the eyes of many fans. Sonic Heroes is rushed, it's glitchy, it's not the most well thought out, and it has serious pivotal problems. And yet, it's still the best 3D Sonic game in my opinion. When I say this, I think it's important to distinguish the fact that this isn't really praise for Sonic Heroes as much as I think it's a general marking on the series. I say this not to be negative, but more so I'm frustrated that every Sonic game, including my favorite one, has issues with being rushed or just missing the mark in some form. And I'll get the obvious games out of the way, like Sonic Generations probably is better, but since it's not based on any original concepts and requires context from the rest of the series, I don't really count it. It's kind of like counting a re-recorded greatest hits album as a musical artist's best album. Like, okay, that came from other stuff, bro. Adventure 2 I sometimes think is the best game, but I just find myself gravitating a bit more towards Heroes. And these things are ultimately subjective, so if you disagree with me, I'm suing you for damages. Look, Sonic Heroes to me just does the most right. It has a compelling enough gameplay loop, the presentation is the best this series ever got, and it's just a good time to play as long as you accept it's gonna be a chaotic time. No pun intended. But since I put in all the work to do the 4 stories, let's look at that final chapter. So the final boss isn't Eggman, who turned into a purple puddle of piss. The final enemy we face is Metal Sonic, another deep-cut Sonic character who first appeared in Sonic CD. You then have to fight whatever the hell this is as Team Dark, Team Rose, and Team Chaotix. It's really kind of difficult to know what to do here and not intuitive. There's a light that pops up that can be either yellow, red, or blue. You'd think that means using the character that corresponds with said color, right? Well, this is Sonic Heroes, so that would make too much damn sense. The color means you can't use that character. Why reverse it that way, especially when the color coding has been a pivotal theme of the game, and his health bar just goes down so damn slow. And when you're fighting for that long, if you die like 40 hits in, you have to do those 40 hits all over again. Like, this takes forever.
Sonic, we're counting on you.
Why? Okay, anyways, after you get through this pile of dog shit, you then do the supersonic section, which has you flying through the clouds. I'm sorry, but this controls like absolute dog water. I don't even think the controls would be that huge of an issue if it weren't for the fact that you need a consistent stream of rings to survive, or else you just die. So instead of being able to focus up your team blast, your only method of attack here, you have to spend your time flying around and trying to grab these red balls that have rings just to barely survive. You have to do 4 team blasts in order to win. And you need such a stupidly high amount of rings to supply surviving that long. Part of the issue is you get attacked by chaos control on the other end, which you can only minimize by wiggling the control stick, which the game doesn't tell you, by the way. You have to know that was a function from the Sonic Adventure games, which I, honest to God, just forgot was entirely a thing from Adventure 2. my bad. This boss sucks. I played this game 4 times and this is the reward? Insert generic happy ending here. A brief aside, but Super Monkey Ball 2 is one of my favorite games of all time. I know that might seem random just talking about Monkey Ball out of nowhere, but I bring it up to say something I loved about Sega games in this era. Graphics were charming. There was always stuff to appreciate and look at. So I do give Sonic Heroes more points than something like Colors, Lost World, or Frontiers. Maybe those all do have better qualities and technicality, but they just don't have the same feel or charm to them. And I think that's a big reason why I will always place this higher than most Sonic and Sega games. This represents an end of an era for the Sonic franchise, as soon to come after this was the direct downfall of the entire series, which arguably still continues to this very day. There's been decent games here or there, occasionally something that looks good, but it's locked behind a frickin' Apple arcade game, removing all goodwill it even presented in the first place. But this series has not once felt like it did during the GameCube era, and probably never will. That's why I get confused when Sonic Adventure fans or classic Sonic fans disregard this game. I understand not playing 4 playthroughs, I would recommend against that, but at least I feel like anyone who likes Sonic should play through the Sonic storyline. Don't worry about the other stuff. You might find something special here, and with an objective eye, this is still better than most Sonic games. As for Sonic Heroes, this game has sort of fallen into the background and doesn't seem to be acknowledged by even Sega. This game would be re-released approximately twice, and both times were basically technicalities. One was this Sonic PC collection, which was a pretty cool package including Heroes, Riders, Adventure DX, and Mega Collection. This would release in 2009, and I can't even find one listing of it on eBay, so I can't even buy it. I would not anyway. And the PS2 version would release on PS3 via the PlayStation Network, in Japan only. Cool. And that's it. Will this game ever be ported? Will it ever be remade? Rumors say it will. Those rumors are full of crap. So this is kind of the tragic tale of Sonic Heroes. It's a game they either really like or really hate. And I think that's a bit upsetting because out of all the Sonic games, I think it does the most right. Every 3D Sonic game has kind of been flawed. Now, I'll be serious for a second. I really feel like Sega needs to stop making a bunch of 5 and 6 out of 10 Sonic games and just invest their time into one game. And I think I have the perfect idea for it. No, I don't. I'm a game reviewer. It's not my job. You do it, Sega. Why do fans have to do everything for you? Why do fans have to fix Sonic 06? Why do fans have to tell you what's wrong with the new Monkey Ball games? Sega, get your stuff together. Hire someone who can make a freaking 10 out of 10 game and earn your praises back from the highest grace of God. I'm done. I have nothing else to say. Screw everyone.